This video is sponsored by Paradox Interactive. Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're diving back into Age of Wonders 4, taking a deeper look at the typical mid to late game challenges. Naturally, the specific faction you build will have an impact on some aspects, and you can watch the faction customization video and early game tips video I've linked in the description and pinned comment down below for a better understanding on those fronts. While I'll be specific at times here, I'm aiming to make this video as applicable across the board as possible, and I'm hoping there's something in here for newcomers and veterans alike. For more information about the game, check out the link in the pinned comment below, and for more Age of Wonders 4 content, including an upcoming Let's Play, don't hesitate to subscribe. With that said, and with timestamps down below, let's begin. The victory conditions. Aside from realms with the Pretender King's victory conditions, the victory conditions become more and more relevant as the game goes on, as you discover who you're up against and as you realize your position among them, both in terms of opinions and potential for friction, and also quite literally geographically speaking. You'll eventually get a clearer image with regards to what you can realistically pursue as you get closer to the mid-game, but it's not a bad idea to set yourself up for the victory you want early on, settling for an alternative if push comes to shove. So, let's take a look at the various victory conditions and how you might want to maximize your chances for each one. The military victory is the most self-explanatory of the lot. It involves defeating all the other factions. In order to do so, you need to kill their ruler in combat, forcing them into the astral void, and then you need to capture or otherwise destroy their throne city. A simple yet involved process that we'll get into in just a little bit. Any ruler that gets defeated in battle, including your own, will respawn at the throne city, so it's essential that the city be dealt with to completely remove the enemy from the equation. Note that if you decide to allow allied victories, you do not have to defeat factions with whom you have an alliance. In order to secure an alliance, you'll first need to develop a wizard's bond, increasing relations to then establish a defensive alliance, and then eventually establishing a full-fledged alliance. Heads up though, if you're allied with somebody, you will get dragged into their wars, whether they're the aggressor or defender, so you don't want to be too gung-ho about establishing alliances with the warmongering types. Improved relations result from actions, trades, gifts, and decisions you make and how they compare to a particular AI's personality. So it's not likely you'll be able to ally everybody, and even when alliances form, keep in mind they're not necessarily permanent. Next up is the expansion victory. This one especially benefits from some planning ahead, and as you might be able to tell, it's one that I was targeting with my Ratkin. The expansion victory asks an empire to control a large number of provinces as determined by the realm's size, and only then can said empire build the beacons of unity. These need to be built across 3 different cities and then lit, after which you'll need to defend them for 15 turns against an onslaught of attacks. This means you'll need at least 3 cities that are directly under your control for when you decide to build the beacons, but otherwise, make sure you're taking advantage of vassal contributions too. Quickly scouting and finding free cities first is important here, and you can give them whispering stones to make them vassals before taking the stone away to give to somebody else. You can't give whispering stones to free cities that are already another empire's vassal, so you have to move quickly to get to that relationship status with as many free cities as possible, as quickly as possible. Then, you can double back and further strengthen those vassal relationships to bonded vassalage across the board. Whispering stones are in limited supply, so this helps you get the most mileage out of the one you typically start with, though the right kind of empire development will net you additional whispering stones to use simultaneously. You can also release cities as vassals, and since that happens at a bonded vassal level, they'll still count towards your required province count without needing a whispering stone to bolster your relations. For the cities you decide to hold on to though, keep in mind the importance of farms, pastures, food production structures, and the use of Imperium to accelerate the growth of said cities, allowing you to claim more provinces more quickly. The magic victory has some similarities here, though rather than building beacons, you need to build 3 specific affinity province improvements. These have to be of the same affinity, as determined by your tome selection when picking Tier 3, Tier 4, and Tier 5 tomes, and once you've built these special province improvements, you have to cast a spell for 15 turns while defending the 3 improvements against enemy armies. Whereas food was the primary resource to hunt with the expansion victory, here you're chasing knowledge, as that's what lets you make progress through the tomes more quickly. Find the right provinces, use outposts and cities alike to exploit them, and otherwise try to accumulate knowledge through events and city structures too. Bear in mind that when a faction builds any one of these specific province improvements, the location of it is revealed to all, so prepare to have a target painted on your back. Finally, the score victory is a little bit more obscure. My understanding is that it's determined through the size of your military, the number of provinces you control, and your overall magical and economic standing. This condition only triggers when the timer runs out, and it's a more holistic look at your performance. Ideally though, you'll want to secure one of the other victory types instead. Imperium and Empire Development. Imperium is a key resource that you can use for a few things. It can help rush the growth of a city, it's essential to establish new cities, and it can hurry along the improvement of relations with free cities. All that aside, don't forget to invest Imperium in Empire Development too. The Empire Development screen is divided into 7 branches, with 6 of them dedicated to an individual affinity each, and the 7th acting as a more generic set of potential upgrades. Each turn you make progress along these paths at the rate of your affinity per turn, up to a maximum of 500. As you can imagine, you'll typically reach the end of the generic branch fastest, since the progress there is at the total sum of all of your affinities combined per turn instead of one individual affinity. Unless you have a very specific story you want to tell with your faction, it's not a bad idea to take a look at the screen early on and allow it to influence your decisions throughout the early game to make sure things are working as you need them to in the late game. Since tomes are what primarily determine your affinities, having a high rate of research through a large amount of knowledge generation per turn is an excellent way to accelerate just how quickly you get access to these options. Rarely do these branches have prerequisites. For example, you need Forced March before you can get Tireless Marchers. Typically, you can pick and choose as you'd like, as long as you've made enough progress down the associated path, and as long as you have enough Imperium banked up. At times, your faction will also start with some of these upgrades on hand, like Excavation for our underground adapted rats here, and at other times, a specific option will be completely irrelevant to you. Basic seafaring, for example, is useless in a realm that doesn't have oceans and seas, and expanded governance is only really necessary if you're planning on going over your city cap. For an expansive empire, it's a good idea to secure Forced March and teleporter infrastructure so that your armies can move around more quickly. If you're looking to win through the expansion victory conditions, you might want to consider the Nature affinity, as it has quite a few options that either accelerate food production or otherwise make it easier to gain additional population in your cities, allowing them to claim additional provinces more quickly. The Order affinity is especially powerful if you have a large number of vassals or intend to have a large number of vassals under your command, and many of its later options are focused around exploiting your vassals for additional resources and troops alike, or otherwise making it easier to acquire said vassals in the first place. The Astral affinity works great with teleporters, using them as healing nodes of sorts, and it's great for those prioritizing knowledge and mana, with opportunities to summon, provide experience to, or otherwise reduce the cost of magical units in particular. It can also make casting on the battlefield cheaper if used right. The Shadow affinity in the late game lets you see everything, which is a great way to stay ahead of your enemies, and it also lets your armies heal in enemy territory, normally something limited to friendly territory, making it a lot harder to push deep behind enemy lines. This is a pretty big upgrade for aggressive factions. You can also gain access to an extra Whispering Stone here, though it happens much later compared to the Order affinity, and apart from that, this branch also helps with casting on the battlefield too. Chaos affinity has some really cool options down the line, like the option to summon flying mythic units that cause a ridiculous amount of damage. It also makes gold income a bit of a cakewalk if you're willing to raise enemy cities, and it can help you grow your population through the raising of enemy cities too. You can quickly recruit additional troops by providing all of your cities with a sudden burst of draft, and you can use Lure of the Horde, Skilled Raiders, and Rite of War to maintain a constant amount of aggression, acquiring additional units or otherwise keeping them healthy through the use of pillaging. Using Forced March to get around becomes significantly cheaper and a bit more viable with Tireless Marchers too. The Materium affinity helps reduce the cost of your army, especially if you take care not to lose units, and it's great if you're planning on playing particularly defensively, though even when playing as an aggressor, Siege Masters can be extremely helpful. Be careful not to pull the trigger on stuff like the Rite of the Dreadnought too early though. The bonus is nice, but you want to make sure as many units as possible are able to take advantage of it. Otherwise, one can never underestimate the value of something like the Rite of Wealth. As you can see, each of these branches has its own benefits to provide, and while there are good early options too, they sometimes become less relevant in the late game, so you want to make sure you're moving down these branches as efficiently as possible so you've made progress in keeping with the rest of the realm. Choosing your tomes appropriately is essential for this. Each one has its own affinity, and you can actually search by affinity when picking to make sure you're not distracted by all the temptations of the other tomes, especially if you're trying to chase after a particularly juicy Empire skill that's further down the line for one of these branches. Now, remember, don't forsake access to powerful spells and units just because you're pursuing certain options on this screen though. As always, it's a matter of balancing between your options to acquire the tools that you want and need. Just make sure you're not taking such a haphazard approach that you end up as a jack of all trades but a master of none, especially when it's the last leg of the game and you could desperately use some of the skills and rights that remain just out of your reach. Military superiority. Fighting against infestation armies, marauders, and garrisons at wonders is one thing. Fighting against quest armies can be quite challenging too, but as the game goes on, you'll find yourself locked in conflict against other factions and free cities, and that's where things can get particularly challenging. It's a good idea to have a few full-strength armies out and about as soon as possible, keeping in mind upkeep costs of course, and it's also a good idea to secure an additional hero or two early on as well. Heroes need time to level up, and though you'll sometimes have access to higher level recruits, you don't want to wait to find out, and that aside, if they do come leveled up, it means you aren't able to customize their skills as much as you might like. That aside, there's a ton of equipment strewn about the world, waiting to be picked up and put to use, and if you're not trading them with other factions, you should be testing them out in battle to find your synergies for when the big wars kick off. Back on the topic of units though, don't underestimate the value of Rally of the Lieges and Summoning Magic. Rally of the Lieges gives you a selection of units to recruit based on what units your vassals have access to, as well as decisions you may have made elsewhere. Every handful of turns, an additional rally is made available to you, and you can pick and choose as many units as you'd like, as long as the sum total cost is affordable for you to add them to your own or your vassals' active armies, with the latter being cheaper to do. And apart from that, you also have to make sure the sum total recruitment points cost is within your limits too. Recruitment points cap is increased by having higher tier vassalage from your vassals, or from having more vassals at the same level. Basically, the more vassals you have and the more loyal they are to you, the higher your recruitment points cap, and that means you can acquire more troops when the rally happens. This can take a concentrated effort, but it pays dividends in the long run as it can add much needed variety to your forces, giving you access to tools that fill gaps in your regular roster. Bear in mind that when you do recruit units through the Rally of the Lieges, it takes a few turns for them to appear, and they appear either at your vassal city or at your own throne city, depending on which option you chose. This can sometimes mean they'll end up well out of position, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. First, let's discuss the option to summon units absolutely anywhere you desire. Many tomes will give you access to summoning spells. These can take as little as one turn to charge up, and then you can cast them anywhere on the world map to summon the corresponding unit. At times, this can help defend an isolated outpost. At other times, this can bolster an army shortly after battle. Or it can fill out an army that was just short of being full just before a battle, potentially turning the tide of an upcoming engagement. You can only prepare one spell at a time, but you can have a bunch prepared at once, so try to always keep at least a couple of these summoning spells ready for emergencies. Yes, I would argue that, especially in the late game, the surprise arrival of a few additional units on the campaign map can absolutely change things, and what's more, newly summoned units are able to move immediately after being summoned, which means if your other armies aren't able to reach a targeted enemy army, you can use summoned units to trigger the battle instead. It's a neat little trick to catch your opponents out of position. On the topic of being out of position, as described with the Rally of the Lieges earlier, sometimes you'll find your newly acquired units showing up far from the action. This can be the result of a rally or just the result of your units being recruited at a far-off city. It's bound to happen sooner or later, but fortunately, there are a few things you can do to get ahead of it. For one, there are special province improvements available through tomes that can act as recruitment locations. Though the Tome of the Horde is a Tier 1 tome, the mob camp it provides can come in handy well into the late game. The Tier 4 Tome of the Demon Gate provides the Demon Gate province improvement that shares this same trait with the mob camp. Build either of these special province improvements close to the edge of your city and assign them as the designated unit deployment location. Then, anytime the associated city recruits any units, they'll show up at this distant province instead, far from the city center, but potentially closer to your front. And if you ever want to revert your decision and have the units show up at the city center instead, it's of course very simple to do so, as you can see on screen. Note though that once you put something like a mob camp down, there's no going back and changing its location without taking a few extra steps, so keep that in mind and take it into consideration before rushing into the decision. You can see here with my throne city of Centerpike, it made sense for me to drop the mob camp next to the underground passage. That way, all new recruits could immediately go up to the surface and reinforce my armies at the front. But what about after recruitment? Well, teleporters are an excellent way to get your troops moving long distances in an instant, and proper teleporter placement will allow your armies to respond to evolving threats within moments. What's more, with the Teleporter Pact, you can actually share access to teleporters with other factions. Teleporters become available once you've acquired the appropriate Empire skill and actually gone ahead and built them. But you can also use the Tome of Teleportation to build Chrono Gates. They act similarly. And then there's the Tome of the Demon Gate, which provides the Demon Gate for similar purposes too. These are province improvements just like the teleporter, but they provide added benefits as well. However you gain access to them, the ability to move quickly from one end of your empire to another is essential, especially if you need to find underground passages and deal with their shenanigans too. Developing distant cities solely for the purpose of teleporting armies behind enemy lines isn't a terrible idea either, especially in the late game when your economy can support these kinds of moves. That is, if you can find an empty slot to establish a new city in, of course. But hey, if you're lacking space for that, you can always just take cities from your enemies instead. Taking an enemy's throne city is essential to the military victory, but even outside of that, taking other cities off them is a great way to cripple their economy and generally slow them down and tear them apart while improving and expanding your own empire. Anytime you're eyeing an enemy city to attack, you'll want to see how fortified it is to get an idea of how long you'll have to sit outside it with a siege first. Throne cities all start fortified, but others need to build structures to get fortifications, unless of course they start with them because of some faction effects. Either way, these fortifications can always be improved, and it's a great idea to do so for your own most important and exposed cities because of how much of a difference it can make to how quickly an enemy army can capture the city. Take a look at our siege on Primo Nebula here. Because of how fortified it is, it'll take quite a few turns for us to punch through and kick off our assault. In that time, the enemy can recruit additional troops and send them in to reinforce. Any army, allied or otherwise, that sits within this highlighted area around the city will get involved in the battle for the city, so it's essential not to let the enemy get too much prep work done. You can use siege projects to speed your work up, with some doing more or less per turn damage to fortifications depending on how much you're willing to invest, or you can use these siege projects to harm the enemy defenses in other ways instead, slowing down the progress of the siege itself, but maybe giving you an advantage in the battle to follow. Either way, it doesn't hurt to have siege specialization or, if available, siege masters on hand, especially in the late game, to help hurry through enemy defenses. As for fighting the actual battles themselves, that might be a topic for another time. If you want a battlefield guide to Age of Wonders 4, let me know in the comments down below and I'll get working on one as soon as I can, but hopefully this video helps you out with the mid to late game of Age of Wonders 4, at least on the campaign map. For help with the early game, check out the video I've linked on screen right now, and as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. They'll keep us alive and running smoothly, and of course a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.